thank you very much for welcoming me to give a talk here today on the Canadian war brides of the Second World War. Now, this picture right here is a very special photo. The mother and father of Michelle Rusk, Chamberlain, Lloyd Cochrane, and Olive Rayson Cochrane on their wedding day on May 8th, 1943 at All Saints Queensberry Church in Stanmore, Middlesex, England. Isn't that a beautiful photograph? That would have been a lovely wedding, and an unusual wedding to have such a everybody all dressed up with the beautiful flowers, because as we all know, during rationing, it wasn't easy to get all the material and the flowers and everybody together. The very fact that they were able to get everybody to get together in one room is an achievement in itself, given the exigencies of the war and the fact that the men often got called away when, even though the wedding was scheduled. Too bad, the military comes first. My name is Melynda Jarratt, and I have a Bachelor of Arts from the University of New Brunswick, and I have a Master of Arts from UNB, where I did my master's thesis on the war brides of New Brunswick. Now, I went on also because I found that it was very useful for me. And at that time, I got a diploma in digital media. That's what that DDM is. So I'm a Canadian historian, and I'm a built heritage advocate, actually, too. I'm very much involved with the preservation of built heritage. But the thing that has really driven me for the last 30 some years is war brides. War brides, war brides, war brides. I used to say, my poor husband used to say to me, it's like the Elvis Presley channel, all 24/7 at our house, but except it's war brides. And we used to have a good laugh about that. But I also established the CanadianWarBrides.com website in 2000. And the reason I did that was because I found that there was so much misinformation out there about war brides, and it was really driving me crazy, because I knew that the sources were there for people to access, but they didn't know how. And of course, this was just the beginning of the internet, really. 2000. We're already 21 years since I established that website, and at the time it was pretty leading edge, or so I thought so. And it's considered one of the authoritative websites on the history of the Canadian war brides, and it contains quite a bit of information that you might not find anywhere else, and it came from my research mostly. Now, I've also been involved with film, radio, television over the years, BBC, CBC, Dutch television, Belgian television, Scottish Channel 4, I mean, you name it. There have been a lot of documentaries done on the war brides, and I'm usually involved in it in one way or the other. And I've also been involved in the whole issue of the war children of the Second World War, issues of citizenship, and lost, what are also known as the lost Canadians. So I've done a lot of things over the last year that grew out of my initial research on war brides. So why would I be interested in war brides? Well, my mother, as I said, is 104, but my mother herself is not a war bride. Her sister, my aunt Anna, married a Norwegian merchant marine who she met during the Second World War. And there they are in the photograph. And my uncle Henrik was a captain of the SS Borkum, and he was offshore when the Nazis invaded Oslo or Norway. And following the directions of King Haakon, he did not return to Norway. All the ships that belonged to the Norwegian fleet were told not to return because the Nazis would take them, and to go to the nearest friendly port. Well, the nearest friendly port for my uncle Henrik was in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. And there, in fact, is a beautiful monument there to the Norwegians who turned Lunenburg into their home port during the Second World War. And they plied the seas of the Atlantic and the Pacific coast, or Atlantic coast, excuse me, in South America, North America, and of course back and forth across the doing duty with transporting munitions during the Second World War. So he had quite an amazing experience, and my aunt met him, and very interesting story, as they all are. And so I always knew about this war bride thing. But my aunt, she went to Norway. So it wasn't really, they were called the brides of the midnight sun. But she went to Norway, and she was a Canadian woman marrying a Norwegian man. So it wasn't the same thing as I found out later. Now, as I said, I always knew about war brides. My mother was a medical secretary, had been a medical secretary for almost 70 years, actually. And she worked almost her whole life and into her elderly years, and as a medical secretary. And she, of course, got to know everybody in the small town that I come from in Bathurst, New Brunswick. And I can still remember the English war brides, one particular lady, Grace Baggs, phoning up my mother, my poor mother. Grace Baggs was deaf as a post, and she'd be yelling on through the phone and wanted something from my mother from the doctor. She'd phone my mother at her house, for goodness sake, and bypass the office altogether. So I always knew about these war brides, and I knew there was a lady who lived down the street, and she had a funny accent, and all the kids had Italian names, and I couldn't figure that one out. Giovanni and Esmeralda and all these. But I found out only when I started doing my research that, in fact, Mrs. Anna Levine, which Levine in Bathurst is what we consider a Acadian name, French certainly, was an Italian war bride, and that there were only 26 Italian war brides in the entire war bride phenomena of the Second World War who came to Canada. So it took a long time before I really understood the full breadth of the Canadian war bride experience. So when it all really happened was I started doing my master's degree, and I knew I had to pick a subject for my thesis. And I had been, I had a natural interest in Canadian military history, and I'd taken every single course I could possibly take, coming from a family of veterans. You grow up at the Legion, the Wing, I'm trying to think of the name of the Navy hangout. I can't remember what they called it, but anyway, we had all the military branches of the military in our family, and so you grew up in that environment. And so the Second World War was a big part of me growing up, and I naturally wanted to do something about the Second World War. I wanted it to be about women, but I did not want it to be about guns and blood and guts and military operations and machine gun, all that stuff. That didn't interest me. I was more interested in social history. And I met this lady. Her name was Jenny Langan. And Jenny Langan will live on for as long as I can tell this story, because Jenny Langan was a Scottish war bride. And I met her, and I said to myself, there's my subject. Now, at that time, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. That was 1987. Here I am almost 35 years later, and I am still talking about the wonderful war brides of the Second World War. Now, it took me a while to finish my thesis because I started working, but by May 1995, we're talking about 7 years later, I'd done a lot of different things. I'd been working full time, etc. And I knew I really wanted to get that thesis done in time for the 50th anniversary of the Second World War, of the end of the Second World War. Or the 40th anniversary. So I decided that I would finish it. So I went back to the UNB. I kept my connection to UNB, and I said, it's time to finish it. And sure enough, we got it done on time. I had it done. In fact, it was sent over with my war brides who went to Europe and to Britain to mark the anniversary. It was distributed in England to some people over there. They brought my thesis over them. So the thing about my thesis was that it was the very first time that someone had done a scholarly analysis of the Canadian war bride story. That was the thing, that was the landmark about my thesis. Until then, no one had really done that. Before that, 1978, Joyce Hibbert had written a book called The War Brides, and many people might know that book, a lovely book. And she was followed by Peggy O'Hara, 1983, Olga Raines, We Became Canadians. Peggy wrote From Romance to Reality. So in a period of a very few years, and it's not surprising, because what you have here is the children are all leaving the nest. The women are now turning in, they've got time on their hands. The children are all grown up, going to university or have left, married, and they're alone, and they're thinking about their life experiences. And the International Year of the Woman in Canada offered an opportunity for Joyce to get some funding, and she was encouraged to write this book. So Joyce wrote the first book, which would be considered, I'd say, the seminal work. And the thing is, it formed this sort of stereotype or standard for all other works that came out of that genre, they were mainly anecdotal. There were no footnotes. They were often self-published. Now, Joyce's wasn't. Joyce's, maybe her first edition had been self-published, but as you can see, the beautiful front cover, the binding, it was well done. And but Peggy's was self-published, and so was Olga's. Actually, Olga printed it in a photocopier with the spiral binding. But it's an oral history that without the I'm not saying that only scholars or people with master's degree can apply that academic rigor, because that's not true. A lot of people don't have masters and PhDs and do a darn good job. But in this case, these ladies, the oral history was not in many cases, were not properly fact-checked. And that just happens because of memories, right? We've all interviewed and talked to people who say things that are incorrect, and you don't bother correcting them because you don't want to sort of hurt their feelings, right? But so I guess it's that kind of idea is just accepting what they say without fact-checking. But you know what? Still critically important work. I mean, without this work, we would never have seen the beginnings of the interest in the War Bride story, I believe. So I'm just going to very briefly describe my research results. I'm not going to get too bogged down in this because there's so many great stories to tell. I don't want to make you bored with statistics. But I guess this is, the bane of my existence. And this is why one of the things the reason why I decided I had to do that website. And this is a screenshot from my website. It is the resume of marriages and births. So I poured through every single annual report from the Department of the Immigration Branch of the Department of Mines and Resources, because during the 1930s there wasn't, not like today, there was Citizenship and Immigration Department. Immigration was on such a low priority that it became a branch of the Department of Mines and Resources. Like, that's how important immigration was during the 1930s. In fact, during the 1930s, you may as well just say there was no immigration. And of course, there was no westward, very little westward and eastward back and forth between England and Canada, even during the war, except for people who had priority reasons for going back and forth. And those would be only men mostly, and they'd be military. They'd had to have a darn good reason to be going back and forth because of the exigencies of war. All that shipping was tied up. They had to bring food to Britain. They had to bring munitions to Britain. They had to bring soldiers to Britain. They had to bring supplies. They weren't going to be filling people with women coming back and forth with, like they had in the First World War. The First World War, the wives of officers, Canadian officers, they set up house in London. They got themselves, they did the social circuit. That did not happen in the Second World War. They were not going to have a repeat of that. So I had to go through all of these records and plunk out the numbers. And what always irritated me was that I had heard that there were 48,000 marriages. And so you often see this, even at Pure 21, it says 48,000 war brides came to Canada. Well, actually, no, there were nearly 48,000 marriages. Yes, that is very true. No question about it. As the numbers show right here, you can see under wives, 47,783. However, not all those wives came to Canada. About 10% never came to Canada. And the reasons are varied. They go, and I didn't want to go too deep into that issue, but I will tell you that there's some great stories there, the reasons why war brides didn't come to Canada. And about 4,400 never made it. So the reasons why, well, maybe their husband got a job. maybe she didn't want to leave. Her father had a garage, and he had got training. He was trained as a diesel mechanic, and hey, you know why he liked it. Maybe he was an orphan, and he didn't nothing for him to go back to. Maybe all his brother had inherited the farm while he was gone, and there was no farm to go back to. Like, the reasons why people never came back are varied, but there were also other reasons why war brides didn't come too. Divorce was a big one. I'd say probably half of the 4,400 of the women who never came here, it was because of divorce. Marriages made in haste, and we'll talk about that later. And, tuberculosis, big thing. We talk about pandemics today. Well, tuberculosis was like a pandemic in a way. Well, not a pandemic, it was an epidemic. There was no cure. Penicillin had just been invented, and they were being very judicious in the dispensing penicillin. It had to go to soldiers who were dying on the battlefront. So, very few people actually got that penicillin, and some people couldn't handle the penicillin. So they were quarantined. There was a lot of that stuff. Insanity. I'm surprised when I look at the records. Bigamous marriages, lots of bigamous marriages, lots. And because it's not like today, can't pick up the phone and phone up, the next door neighbor or the mayor, or double check their entry on the internet or Facebook and see if they've got a wife. Like, there was a lot of shenanigans going on. So of these 48,000 about, like I say, 10% didn't come, and there are all kinds of reasons why. But hey, the vast majority of them did come, and of those who did come, and of those marriages, 80% of them are from the army, and that's not surprising because they were on the ground. Let's be realistic. They are the ones that the war brides are meeting. The women are meeting on the streets. They're in the theaters, etc. All the ways that they meet. RCAF. Oh, who would want to marry an airman? Woohoo! Those great uniforms, and of course, Navy. Lesser opportunities to meet Navy men, simply because they're offshore. So here are some of those. I did a summary, and maybe some of you may recognize Jean and George Spears here with Kate, Duchess, in a visit to Ottawa. But 94% of the war brides were British, and of course that makes sense. I mean, the Canadians were the first to arrive. December 17th, 1939, they arrive. They are there for 6 years. They're in the countryside, they're in the villages, they're in the towns and the cities, they're billeted with families. Many of them are British themselves. Some of them are born in Britain. Some of them, their cousins and uncles and aunts still live there, and they're meeting the girls next door and the cousins, and everybody's meeting everybody. So it's not surprising. And 4% are Dutch. 2% are Belgian, and the lesser numbers from various other countries are statistically insignificant. And they include Chile, for goodness sake, Norway. There's quite a few from Newfoundland, to tell you the truth, Newfoundland being its own country at that time, separate from Canada. So Newfoundlanders are war brides. My next door neighbor, right where I am right now, my next door neighbor, her mother was a Newfoundland war bride. Her father was a prisoner of war of Japanese. So here we go. And now I'm going to talk to you about the statistics of coming to Canada, the total number. Now look at those numbers. So as I said, you look at very little immigration coming to Canada in 1942, 1943. They're practically nil before that. There's hardly anything happening prior to 1942, 43. Yes, there are some women who are coming, and some of you who are here today may, your mother or father your mother may have come here prior to 1942. I do know of women who do, but look at that, 1942, 188 women. These are rare, and a lot of them are RCAF women. And boys, oh boys, the Army people didn't like that. There was a big, who do those Air Force people think they are? And the Air Force used to say, well, when you get into the fight, then you could start complaining. But it's true. The Air Force was fighting. There was an air war, and the Army guys hadn't really got as they called it, the phony war until 43, and in fact 42 Dieppe, 43 Sicily. So you see the marriages start to climb here. The number of war brides arrival starts to climb. So in 43, 44, 1,255, and that's 14% of the entire immigration for that year. Then the next year, there are 12,000 immigrants, and of those, half of them are war brides and dependents. Then you see the numbers start to climb. 71% of the immigrants in 45, 46 are war brides and their dependents. Then you see the gates start to open in 1946. They're starting to let displaced persons in. So the numbers go down a little bit, but you also have more people coming in too. And there's 39,000 war brides and dependents come in between 46 and 47. That's over nearly 55%. And then you see 47, 48, the numbers go back down. Okay, so the total number of war brides and dependents between 42 and 48 is 64,446. That's 43,451 war brides and 20,997 children altogether between 42 and 48, when it finished. When the war bride transport finished. So there you go. That's it's quite a significant number. And I always say you've got 55% at nearly 40,000. You've got the majority, 45,320, arrived between 46 and 47. So they called this Operation Daddy. This is Helen Hitchin here. She's with her little fella, Robbie. They ended up in Belleville, Ontario. Now, the Operation Daddy, that's what they called it. The press called it Operation Daddy. I mean, they were looking, I think the Americans called it Operation Diapers or something like that. Now, it began on February 6, 1946, with the RMS Mauritania departing from Liverpool. There's a fabulous photograph of that. And it was carrying 900 war brides and children. And this was fully documented and heralded in the press. And I want to mention that it's quite important for you as a researcher when you're thinking about trying to trace a war bride's journey. I got to tell you, it's easy. I mean, if you know how to do it, because unlike today, where everyone has the Privacy Act prevents you from saying just about you can't say anything. In the newspapers of the day, to hell with the Privacy Act. There was no Privacy Act. They printed everything. They printed the names of every single war bride when she arrived at Halifax, and her children's name, her husband's name, where they were going, his military rank, who was meeting them at their destination, when they're expected to arrive. I mean, it's total. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you know when your war bride arrived, or generally, you can probably trace her departure from the British papers or the English Canadian papers. They would say there's a ship coming full of war brides. And if you're from British Columbia or you're from Ontario or Quebec, you just go to your local newspaper or your provincial newspaper. And if your war bride came on a ship at a certain time, it would be in the paper because it was in their interest. That was great news. That was great news. I mean, wow, after all 6 years of misery, death, and destruction, the arrival of so many war brides was excellent public relations. And these are the type of newspaper art photographs that ended up, this was in the Globe and Mail front page, the Toronto Globe and Star, or whatever, I can't remember the name of it right now. But now, the English author Eswin Lisser, who was a great friend of mine, was on that sailing of the Mauritania. I'm just going to read. She was with her little son Terry, and just much like Helen would be. So imagine. Terry and I sailed from Liverpool on the Mauritania in a group of about 1,000 Canadian war brides in the early hours of February 5th. This was the first dedicated war bride sailing, although small groups had made the crossing while the war was still on. From the dock, the Mauritania had looked like a floating warehouse, and most of us assumed that no amount of water could unsteady it. We were wrong. The Atlantic in February gives a watery impersonation of the Canadian Rockies. The good ship Mauretania tilted much too far one way, slid into a valley, tilted as many degrees the other way, and rode a sloping wall of water until nothing could be seen from the porthole but sky. Not that anybody was looking. The process was repeated endlessly for 5 days with predictable results. Well, you can just imagine what the results would be, and we'll talk about them. Now, as I said earlier, imagine all of these women arriving in, it's good public relations, but the media latched onto it, of course, but so did the politicians. And you can just imagine what they thought of this, because, I mean, they've been trying to bring people into this country. They're trying to populate, just like today, the immigration problem. One of the things I say about immigration to Canada is the same old, same old. It's always the same story, trying to bring people into this country. And here you go. I'd say if that happened today, this is what the politicians will be doing. Somersaults. They'd be doing somersaults, because it's all women and their children. They're all from the same age group. They're all of childbearing age, and mainly British and English speaking, and they're from the old country, Britain and Europe. So you can imagine the politicians, they couldn't help themselves. Everybody had something great to say about the war brides, wanted to get their photographs taken with them. It was public relations manna from heaven, the war bride's arrival in Canada. So it's well documented in all of the newspapers. Anybody trying to find information about their war bride can easily trace it through the newspapers of the day. Now, how did they get here? Well, they were organized through the Canadian Wives Bureau, and the Canadian Wives Bureau was, I call it a glorified social services or welfare agency. And boy, was it glorified. Like, those ladies didn't have to do anything. Every possible thing that could be involved with their transportation to Canada was taken care of. They were interviewed. They were invited to, they organized clubs, like in very, the English Roses, depending what city or village you were from, there would be these clubs, and all the war brides from that town would go to, like, they would go to film nights, and they would be shown films on Canada, or be given handbooks and pamphlets. My favorite one is How to Deliver Your Own Baby. Jeez, imagine that one. And another one is cooking for for Canadian wives, how to cook and how to behave yourself. Don't talk about things being better in England. The Canadians have, sacrificed a lot too. It may not seem so with the rationing, but they have sacrificed. They've lost a lot of their men, 50,000. And, don't be putting down Canada. So there was a lot of that kind of thing with these, with the Canadian Wives Bureau. They organized every aspect of the wives' transport. It wasn't perfect. But I'd say there's nothing has ever been done like that ever since. Never. Maybe the Vietnamese transportation, maybe the Syrians, there'll be something similar to it, but not at the same level, and certainly not within a 1940s context with, the attitudes towards women and children, and, the women being the wives of these Canadian servicemen. They would just be swept along by circumstances and be told what to do. So they worked the Wives Bureau was a directorate of the Adjutant General's branch. And now they also have amazing records, okay? Fantastic records. And they worked with the volunteer aid detachments called VADs, such as the Canadian Red Cross. And they were a spectacular organization. And I got to tell you, I met one person who worked with the Wives Bureau on Charles Street in London, and he said it was the time of the worst and the best time of his life. I could just imagine what it must have been like. So now the transatlantic crossings. I'm skipping some things here, like, for example, the hostels. I can't tell every part of this story, but I'll go, the important things here that we want to talk about are the transatlantic crossings, because of course that's what everyone thinks of. And there were more than 50 ships involved in transporting war brides. Every now and then someone will tell me of another one. Some of the more luxurious, the Queen Mary, Aquitania, Lady Rodney, Ile-de-France. Ile-de-France not luxurious, but some of the more ones that come to my mind. Some are better than the others. Banana boats, as one of my Red Red Cross escort officers called it, to cruise ships. And as when Lister said, experiences vary depending on the weather and the departure date. So if you came in summer, depending on when you came in summer, you could be, you know, basking in glory of the sun for a week. If you went in February in stormy seas, it would be a nightmare. And even you know, even in the summer, you could never tell what might happen. It was not necessarily going to be an excellent trip just because it was the summer. So, and then on top of that, these people had been rationed for 5-6 years, and the first time in their lives, they're bananas. The kids are eating bananas, and we've all heard these stories. You know, they're eating fine breads, and they're gorging themselves because it's the first. You know, the children have never even seen a banana before. So lots of diarrhea, constipation, vomiting, you know, stomach upset, and then of course the ocean, whoa, seasickness, and if you throw onto that, you know, bad weather, it could be a nightmare. Now, Kay Ruddick, she was here. I'm just going to show you. Sorry, I want to show you. Here's some passenger lists from Find My Past. Here you see, for example, the list. So these are in terms of sources. Find My Past is where I get my passenger lists, and they're well organized. You can search by the name and first name, last name. And in this case, I just looked up any name, and there's no one in particular. I was actually looking for Esmond Lister, but I couldn't find her quickly, so I just grabbed. But you can see, so they have a number 1686, so that is their priority passenger list number. Then the husband's initials, his military personnel number, or sorry, I think that's his military personnel number. I don't have the sheet in front of me. You've got his name, Lieutenant, you know, Lance Corporal L.C. Miller. The wife's name is May M. The children, she's got children with her, Kenneth, and Kenneth actually has a different last name, so probably from a first marriage, or maybe her husband died. He's 3 years and 5 months. Where is she from? She's from Sussex, Colcombe Lane, exact street number. Where is she going? She's going to a friend in Vancouver. So this group of people are going to Vancouver. They batched them together. Like, they did a very good job of organizing. So this would all be printed in the newspapers, all line for line, until the whole thing. Now, I mentioned earlier about the Red Cross escort officers. They had an incredible job to do, helping the Canadian Wives Bureau. They were engaged by the Wives Bureau as VADs, volunteer aid detachments. They were recruited from across Canada. There were representatives from every province and territory. Kay Ruddick was actually a friend of mine. Kay was from Moncton, New Brunswick, and Kay came from quite a wealthy family and was very disappointed that the war had interrupted her plans to go to finishing school in Switzerland. And she wanted to go, but she wanted to join the Air Force, but her father wouldn't let her. And she was still, you know, finishing high school, and she was determined that she was going to go overseas. So she took the nursing course, preliminary nursing course, that last year of high school. And by the time the war ended, she applied and was accepted to go to become a Red Cross escort officer, and that's what she did. So Kay kept a record of it's rare. She's the only one I know of, a diary of her 1 year. Every single day she wrote something, and that diary is in the provincial archives of the province of New Brunswick. And diaries, letters, records, these are the sorts of things that we need to use to tell these stories. So Kay's diary of her time with the taken from her perspective, you know, and she had some pretty interesting experiences. experiences. I'm just going to quickly read what Kay says here about one of her experiences on the ship, on the Queen Mary. And that ship, well, that was August 31st. And Prime Minister Mackenzie King was on the ship that day. So terrific sea. Around midnight, wave hit the ship and was so huge it splashed in the portholes on top deck and hit the bridge, down the gangway, into the captain's cabin. Electrical equipment put out of commission and ship stopped for 2 hours, bobbing like a cork. Brides, babies, 1,000 brides and 1,000 babies on board. Ship's crew all sick all over the place. Men, civilians, and other passengers turned to help us look after the babies. By morning, the seas had calmed down and the cleanup started. Wet mattresses galore, not to mention gallons of Javix used to clean the cabins and deck. So although it was exciting, it was also not exciting. It was also pretty messy. And it was a lot of hard work. And that's just part of the work that they did. Those ladies did amazing work. Now, we often think about the war brides who came, and when we think of the stereotypical English war bride, that it's a story about ships, but some war brides came by plane, and a lot of people don't know about that. About 500 war brides came by plane for various reasons, including the fact that their husbands had been repatriated due to their injuries and were recuperating in Canada, and the wives were suddenly called to rush to their husband's side in Canada because he was expected to die. So this would be very rare. This did not happen often, but it's still 500 about 500 came to Canada by air. And this photograph right here is an interesting story about a lady who not only did she has several layers of story. She took that photo. That's her at Gander, Newfoundland. And other ladies came as fiancés. There's another whole group of ladies who came as fiancés. And I have stories of women who got fed up of waiting because, as I mentioned earlier, there was a priority passenger list. And if let's, for example, if your husband was dying, obviously you're at the top of the priority list. Or if you had a baby, maybe you would be at the top of the priority list. But if you were a single woman who had a job, maybe you were a nurse and you were doing okay, and you didn't need to rush over to Canada, you'd be at the bottom of the priority passenger list. And so some of these ladies, just the fiancés especially, in one case, I'll tell you the story of Mrs. Zoe Boone. She just said, I've had it. I have had it. I am not waiting any longer. And she bought a ticket and came to Canada on her own in December 1946. She says, I've had it. And one of the reasons she had it was because her husband had been a prisoner of war for 2 years, or fiance, excuse me, had been a prisoner of war from 1943. He was captured in Sicily in July 22nd, 1943. She saw him for 2 weeks after liberation, and then he was rushed back to Canada because he was not married. He was just a fiance, and his parents wanted to see him. So then she had to wait another year and a half, and they were telling her if she wanted to come to Canada as a fiance, she might have to wait another 6 months. She said, to heck with that. She got a plane fare and came to Canada. So that's the kind of things that people did back then if they had to. Now, this lady right here, Anne Biles Lawrence Johnson, long name, there's a reason for that. Anne was a nurse. She's the lady who took the photograph. Anne was a nurse, and she worked in Mearnskirk Hospital, where she met her husband, Ralph Lawrence. And Ralph Lawrence was the first lieutenant of the Athabascan. They were married and spent 2 nights together. And 12 days later, the Athabascan was torpedoed, and he was killed. So she was not. She was devastated. She was devastated, and never got over that. But I'm telling you that because it sort of sets the stage for what happened later. But before this happened to Anne, before her husband was killed, Anne's claim to fame was that she was the ambulance driver who was called out the night that Rudolf Hess's plane crashed into a field outside of Glasgow while he was on a so-called mission of peace to meet the Duke of Hamilton to try to broker a peace deal between Churchill and Hitler, which of course Hitler denied. And she bandaged his leg and drove him back by ambulance to the hospital. And then the next thing you know, the MI5 and everybody else was in there in like a dirty shirt, and she was sworn to secrecy, and she never talked about it. I managed to twist it out of her, but what a story. And but moving forward here. So she marries her husband, and he dies, and then she's just devastated. She doesn't want to be a nurse anymore. She doesn't want to work. She's moping around the house and back in Glasgow, and her husband's best friend, Jack Johnson, who was with the Royal Canadian Air Force, came to meet her. He was supposed to be the best man, but he couldn't come to the wedding because he was called to duty, right? And that summer of 1944, after the Normandy, just in the lead up to the Normandy landings. So she met him, and the small talk, and well, maybe she's a war widow, she's entitled to come to Canada, even though her husband's dead. She's entitled to come to Canada, it's just like anybody else. She could actually come to Canada and start a new life here. She didn't need to she wasn't as a war widow, that was her right. And so she decided that she was going to stay in Glasgow, but she got invited to come to Canada to help launch the Athabascan II in 1946. So she came to Canada on the War Bride ships and stayed in Halifax for the launch of the Athabascan. Then she made her way to New Brunswick by train and went to the family home to meet her husband's people. And lo and behold, who's the next door neighbor? Jack Johnson, the guy she met back in Glasgow. Well, didn't take long. They were falling in love. And she went back to Glasgow and sorted her affairs out. And then that's where that picture of the airplane comes from. She took that on her way back to get married in Canada as a fiancée. So these love stories are convoluted and complicated, but this is what happens when the winds of war, when you get caught up in the winds of war, you're just like a little feather being bounced around. Now, here's another lady. I told you earlier about reasons why people would take an airplane. Fiancé, Scottish war bride. Zoe Boone, another good friend of mine, passed away in 2017. Here, I also have a video of Kay Ruddick taken from CBC. Now, this film was done on Zoe. She explains, it's very short. She explains how she met her husband and well, the circumstances of him being taken prisoner of war. So in his case, he was taken prisoner of war in Sicily. They hadn't gotten married yet, but they knew they were going to get married, but he had to go to Sicily. So he went, he was taken prisoner. And for the next 2 years, he wrote a letter once. He was allowed to write one letter once a month. And over the course of the next 2 years, she received 11 letters because he wrote 22 letters, one to her 1 month, one to his mother the next month. So she has 11 postcards from him and letters. And again, as I explained earlier, fed up of waiting because he was liberated in May, and then he was immediately, they only had 2 weeks together, and he was shipped back to Canada because he was priority. Had not seen his parents for, he'd been prisoner. He had suffered a lot, and he had been on forced marches, and he wanted to go home too, but they wanted to get married, but they couldn't organize it in time. And we'll talk about that. So rural versus urban, 50% of Canadians lived on farms in 1946. So some of these big city girls, they sure got a wake-up call when they arrived in places like Moore's Mills, or like I like to say dog patch. And every province has got a dog patch. Well, some of these ladies, no water, no running water, no electricity, no entertainment, no transportation, no healthcare, no social services for sure. I mean, it was years before we had social services like welfare in this country. And let me tell you, some of their first impressions were not the greatest. And I'm going to just very briefly tell the story of Betty Hillman. Now, Betty came from the Isle of Wight, and she was a fairly sophisticated young lady. You can see her picture. She's Miss Canada in a pageant. She was part of a minstrel show, and she would dance for this visiting the Canadian soldiers. And many of you may have heard of these shows. They call the minstrel shows, entertainment, so like ENSA kind of thing. So there was a whole group of them, and they would all take on a banner. One would be Miss United States, one would be, Miss New Zealand. And well, she was Miss Canada. Well, sure enough, didn't she end up marrying a Canadian? And she ended up in basically Dogpatch, New Brunswick, with her husband's uncle, who was a crotchety old fellow who didn't like the fact that there was this young thing had shown up from England, Isle of Wight, and, you know, disturbed everything. And she expected things to be clean in their dump of a farmhouse and failing farm. And her husband was going to try to fix things up, but it just wasn't working. And the old guy was cranky, and he had a pet crow, and the pet crow hung around, scared her to death. She was, you know, from the big city. What is going on here? There's no road. Literally, they're living in the woods. And she's afraid of everything, afraid of cows. The cow chases her into the water one day, and she's standing there afraid, crying out for help. The cow's got her corner in the water. She looks down, and what does she see? All these minnows around her legs, and that's the water that they're drinking. That's the water they use to drink. She said, "That's it. I've had it. Husband, I'm going home." So you know what he did? He sold 11 pigs. He sold 11 pigs, and he paid her way home. And that was often a way to cure homesickness. So, and then he ended up following her back because he missed her so much. They lived in the Isle of Wight for 12 years, and then they ended up returning to New Brunswick, and their families, well established here in New Brunswick, they ended up staying for the rest of their lives. Now, the lady down below, Selma Smith, she was a Dutch war bride, and I got to tell you what happened to her. She was from The Hague, and a very sophisticated young woman, accountant, had a good job, met her husband in the Liberation, and anyways, ends up in a place called Moore's Mills, which is well, look at the house. You can see the place, you know, dump, you know, I mean, compared to where she was from, you know, geez, look at that situation there. Anyway, she arrived after a long journey in St. John, New Brunswick, and was met, she was 5 months pregnant, and she was met at the bus or the train station by some people from the Red Cross, and they wanted to show her the sights of St. John. And so they wanted to show her all the wonderful new things that they had in St. John, because they wanted to impress her, because, you know, she was a European lady and she had to see nothing but the best in St. John, New Brunswick. So you know where they brought her? They brought her to the bowling alley. And she was like, what? Anyway, that night they put her on a bus. They put her on the bus to St. Stephen, and then from St. Stephen, New Brunswick, which is today it's small, so I can imagine what it was like then. Then they got a taxi, and a whole gang of them got in the taxi, and they drove to the house in Moore's Mill, and they were dropped off at the base of the road and had to walk up in the snow. So they make their way up to the top of the hill. And of course, the family had, in advance of her arriving, had made all these decorations in the windows. Welcome, Selma. They had cake. They had all kinds of cookies. They had gone right to town to welcome their war bride. And they forgot one thing, though. They forgot one thing. They forgot to put the cat out. And the cat got into everything. And when they walked in the door, the whole house was just a terrible disaster. The curtains were dragged down. The bunting that said happy, you know, welcome Selma was gone. The cake, the cat had run over everything. It was just a total mess. And she said, look, I don't care. I just want to go to bed. But her mother-in-law said, well, before you go to bed, I'm going to have to show you where the washroom is. And she goes, oh, yes, thank you. I'll need to use the washroom. And they promptly went out the back door to the two-holer in the backyard. So that was her welcome to Canada. Now, there are so many circumstances of meeting the Canadian soldiers. Now, this is Joan Reichart. And Joan was just a wonderful lady who helped to establish the Canadian War Brides and Families. That's another group that tries to live on, keep the spirit going, mainly run by a lot of the children. Joan met her husband at a dance hall. Eileen Maychaud, she met her husband on a train. He basically, the train was taken off, and she had to get on that train, and he lifted her up and pulled her onto the train. Joanne DeWitt, she met her husband in a barn where she was shoveling out the cow manure. Jean Belding met her husband on the street. These two Canadians she said they were stalking her across the street. And she actually tried to run away from them. Alice Tranquilla, she was a Belgian war bride, and she actually met her husband at the front, Battle of Ardennes. They were on Christmas Eve. Yeah, quite a story. Madeline Fitzgerald, she was a war widow. She met her her husband in, she was a land army girl, and she met him in a potato field where he very smartly asked her if she'd like some help with those bags of potatoes. And Joan Domain, who married, I'm trying to think of his first name, Mr. Domain, a wonderful Dieppe. He had been a prisoner of war, taken prisoner at Dieppe. She met her husband on her front doorstep, where he had asked her if he could leave his bicycle there, and would she watch it for him. So these, I mean, you just never knew how people were going to meet. They met everywhere, blackouts, in the darkness, in the light, and through cousins and friends and relatives, in circumstances that, well, it's just chance, it's fate. That's how people meet, just like today. Now, getting married, well, the first, I always like to tell this story. December 17th, the Canadians arrive at Greenock, Scotland, the first flight of the Canadians. And 28 days or 40 days later, January 28th, 1940, the first marriage takes place between a British woman and a Canadian soldier at the Farnborough Church in Aldershot. And you can see the numbers are increasing here every year. 1940, 1,222, 1941, 3,011, 1942, 4160, 1943, 5897 marriages. And in between 1944 and 1945, there's 33,000 marriages between Canadians and British women and Dutch. Well, as the war starts progressing into Holland, Dutch and Belgian as well. So that is a lot of marriages. And you know what? Those Canadians did not come to Britain to get married and fall in love. They came here to fight a war. So when the marriages started to pile up, this was really causing a problem, because there were social issues that came out of marriages, none the least of which were money, dependence allowance. Where is she going to live? Where is he going to live? Are they going to live together? Are there children? Pregnancy? Is she entitled to Canadian hospital? Who pays for it? He's Canadian. All these complicated things. When is she going to go to Canada? Is she going to go to Canada? And is she a good woman? Like there were some marriages that were made in haste, I'd say, at least. And listen, not just her. He needed to sometimes be checked out too, because there were bigamous marriages and shady characters all around. So here we have an example where the padre often got stuck making the decision about whether the bride was good enough, or if the man was good enough for the bride. And Father Miles Hickey, Raymond Hickey, he was a much beloved padre of the North Shore Regiment, and he knew all his boys, he called them, and he was from the North Shore of New Brunswick, and as the name of the unit implies, and he knew all his Catholic boys for sure, and one of them was this young fellow named Horace Boulay. So in this letter, he's saying, "Dear Miss Riley," so Miss Riley's parents are very worried about their daughter. She's Irish, she's a nurse, and they are very worried. They do not like the fact that their daughter is getting mixed up with this Canadian. Who is this fella? He's got a French name. Where is she going? We're hearing all kinds of terrible stories. These women are being abandoned. Maybe he's a bigamist. So they reach out to the padre, because they're good Catholics. They figured that the Catholic priest is going to tell them the truth. And he does. He says, "Dear Miss Riley, I am the chaplain of the regiment, and one of my boys, Horace Boulay, spoke to me of your intention to marry. Now, Horace is a fine boy from a fine Catholic family. I know them very well, and Horace is a good Catholic." And then he just goes on and on. So he's reassuring the family that, in fact, she's marrying a good man. You're going to be well taken care of. You're going to be very happy. Everything's good. If you're in love, so long as you love one another and are sincere about everything, then everything will be fine. I hope you may be very happy, and you can do by deciding to get married right now, he says. So isn't that wonderful? He also, though, had another lady where he told her, he said, "Listen, do you know where you're going?" He says, "Do you have any idea where you're going?" Here, I think this is hilarious. He says, in one letter, Father Hickey tried to discourage a marriage between a French-speaking Acadian soldier and a Miss O'Brien. from Glasgow by describing to the would-be bride the mountains of snow and ice that would greet her every winter in New Brunswick, and I suppose the same all across Canada. Then, in what Father Hickey believed would deliver a fatal blow to their relationship, he tried to dissuade her from marrying because her husband was francophone and nobody in his little village back in northern New Brunswick could speak English. But Miss O'Brien was not discouraged at all by Father Hickey, and she got her 2 cents worth in with a curt reply to him the next day. Dear Father Hickey, thank you for your letter. As to your first difficulty, I like snow. And secondly, love knows no language. Yours truly, Mary O'Brien. So, you know, it's so cute, but this is the kind of personal intervention that had to start taking place. And it wasn't always pleasant, believe me. Some of the things I've seen in the records, they stopped marriages where they had no darn business doing it. And I'm sure there was a lot of hearts broken, but they did it. Now, settling in, the War Brides clubs were very important at the beginning. And, they had to learn a lot of things, including some of them a new religion, languages, rural versus urban, and they had to adapt and compromise. That was in order to become a good Canadian citizen. We also had experiences where, your typical war bride, we think of the English war bride with her cup of tea. Well, we've got a lady here who's a survivor of the Holocaust, an Austrian Jew who ends up in the Kinder transport in London, England. Their story is incredible. It is the most incredible story. All takes place in England, and their children, the father's a black man from Lakeville Corners in New Brunswick, a descendant of black loyalists, and they had 3 daughters, as you can see, 3 daughters, and an incredible story of resilience and overcoming, their family was wiped out. Another very interesting angle on this whole story is the war children of the Second World War. I mentioned earlier, children whose fathers were Canadian servicemen and their mothers were not married. The most famous one being Eric Clapton. And I don't know if any of you know that story. I can tell you all about it if you're interested. Great story. And now I've written, as I was said earlier, books, films, TV, radio. I've been involved in a lot. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be the person who to be involved and to have met so many wonderful, wonderful people. Unfortunately, many of my war brides are now gone. All of the ones who I would have considered my best friends are now passed. And there's a few left who I've now since picked up and become friends with them too. So it goes on, but it's going to end one of these days very soon, I'm afraid. And the last one will be gone sooner than later. My War Brides website, if you're interested in information, you can always look there. And also our Facebook is very active. And I'd like to thank Annette Fulford, who is here today too, who is an expert in First World War brides. And Annette runs the Facebook page for me. And she's an amazing lady. I know she's also given a presentation. And Annette and I go back a long ways. And I couldn't have done a lot of the stuff that I do without her. So, this War Brides website and the Facebook page together make a very good resource for anybody who's doing research. And if you have any questions, there I go. This is Sergeant Ralph Lloyd and Doris Field, very good friends of mine from Halifax, England.
Thanks, Melynda. That was terrific. I want to thank you for your enthusiastic presentation. You clearly love this topic, and I know that people will find that the information about the number of women, for instance, and their experience will certainly put context to any individual research that they're doing. And your tips for researching will be helpful as well. I do have a couple of questions. Someone asked if Cary Grant actually made a movie called I Was a Male War Bride. Were there any war husbands?
Oh, yes. There. In fact, Judith Kozar wrote a book called, just a second, I didn't know if anyone was going to ask that question. If you just give me a sec. Judith Kozar wrote a book called, I don't know if you can see it.
No, you can't. You'll have to.
Okay, darn. Okay, it's called War Grooms, Canada's War Grooms and the Girls Who Stole Their Heart. And my uncle being one of them, I guess, because he ended up coming back to Canada. Yes, lots of war grooms. And because of the British Commonwealth Air Force training plan, you'll find them clustered in areas where the Air Forces were participating in the BCTAF. I think I spelled that right.
So they came to Canada and married here, as opposed to marrying
Yeah,
women in the Air Force, for instance.
that's right.
In Britain. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So they
Well,
met.
maybe we can send out the name of the title of that book for people that are interested. I'll send that out in a
Sure.
follow-up email. Okay. Someone asked, you talked about the government being organizing people to bring them all over.
Yes.
So someone said, when you were talking about the disillusionment, were there any government sources that tracked war brides' disillusionment with a life that might have been a bit overpromised?
Yes, actually, in the immediate aftermath of their arrival in May, June 1947, the federal government was getting very concerned because there were reports in the papers in England of war brides who were returning en masse, which was not true. And there were, in fact, only maybe a few hundred had initially returned. Over the years, if they wanted to go back, they were perfectly entitled to. But at that very beginning, there were these reports about being treated badly in Canada, and their husbands were no good for nothings and all this stuff, which was, sure, there would have been some, but the vast majority of war brides got along well and settled in, and their husbands were great men and good family men. So they went on the attack. And they did research based on an analysis of the New Brunswick statistics, which is fascinating. And it was in the Globe and Mail and all the papers all across the country. So what they did was, because New Brunswick was considered a microcosm, French, English, rural, urban, Protestant, Catholic, north, south, like they had everything, lakes, rivers, ocean, mountains. So and farmlands and cities. So they did an analysis of the war brides in New Brunswick, and they found that of the 1,820 war brides who had come to New Brunswick, only 12 had left, and only one had left because she didn't like it here. The rest, now, I'm sure that in the following years, I mean, that was pretty early in the arrival.
But the question people were asking was, there any did the government ever track anything? So are there any records that maybe people could look up to find out, like where the women wrote to the government complaining?
That study right there is available. However, no, I would say that, well, yes and no. You have to dig deep into the records. So up until as late as the 1950s, war brides are writing to the government and asking for help to please let me go back to England, because my husband has left me with nothing, or he won't support me, or whatever the issue is. Okay, we're poor, or he's lost his job. We want to go back to England. So there are records for sure. And
okay, I'm wondering if we could send those sources out with a follow-up email as well.
That's RG24. Those are in RG24.
RG24. Okay, well, maybe we can put them in an email with the other things we're going to put there. And one last question, I think. During your research, did you get an appreciation of the impact on single Canadian women who never married because so many young men died or married war brides? Was there resentment in Canada when they arrived home with them?
Oh yes, there was a lot of resentment, and yes, there was, yeah, and there was not nice things that happened too. Like the guy, he promised that he was going to marry his girlfriend in Canada, and then he met someone else and never said anything to anybody. And the next thing you know, there's an announcement in the paper that he's been married overseas. That certainly happened. The big article in Chatelaine magazine. One lady, she only found out about it. She had a baby by this guy in Calgary. He was a Calgary Highlander, and his name was Bush, Boucher, Butcher. I can't remember. Anyway, and so she's reading this Chatelaine magazine article about war brides, and there's her fiance, the father of her child, getting married to someone in England. She knows nothing about it. The family was furious because his own people were mad because they loved her. She lived with them. It was their grandson. Things like that happen. I'm telling you, scallywags.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up the formal question period here. I'd like to thank you again